That was a classic. I think I made that probably 15, 18 years ago. It's been upstairs. She wanted it made so the kids would have a small podium upstairs for their class. Well, that's why it's adjustable. It's adjustable.
I wore it yeah, that's what she said. You know, as long as I have my legs or my core is warm, I don't really
This is about a
it made it down Bill, the last time
well, most of the toys that I made have gotten plans out of when I see something that I think I might use later on, I pull it out. I've got plans out.
Anyway, yeah, he's
Or like I can make fix of it.
it's a pretty big area that's not so the overmarket.
So they like the woodwork, but they'll like up 500
So the toys I made, a lot of them puts a lot of their small items around the face. So I put a lot of wood up there. And then there's good dogs.
My dad was so good at finding.
Well, she'll tell you I have to.
You should join me in Habitat for Humanity. That's my favorite thing. I don't know anyone. It's nice because it's all woodwork. Except if you mess up, they can't kill you. Like when I was with my dad.
I know just enough to be English.
And now it's all doing it. I guess everything has to work. Good morning, everyone. Seems like an especially cheerful Wednesday morning.
Wednesday morning?
Whatever day it is. Some friends from Harding invited me to go camp at the Great Sand Dunes this weekend, and that was a great experience. Everything is covered in sand now. Can't hear me? It's good? Okay. All right. The this is a special Sunday because we're having our young men lead the worship. We have with the song leading and the communion thoughts and the sermon. So I have a challenge for you to encourage them as much as possible because it's really cool how, I mean, when I first brought up the idea, I was nervous. Like I thought it was a long shot, but they were so excited to get to step up and serve more. I even said, like, we kind of always wish we could have done this. So make sure to encourage them with that, and I'm excited. But first we'll get into Jeremiah's rescue, and we'll be reading out of Jeremiah chapter 38. First off, this is kind of an extreme example of if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. Can you give an example of when you followed or did not follow this advice?
When my brain was not engaged with my mouth.
Just keep rambling, keep sometimes speaking straight from the heart, as in the Disney style, does not lead to the best results. I think this is an appropriate start to a lesson today, where I hope y'all can be encouraging to our young men. I like it when I get constructive criticism. If I go several weeks where everyone's like, "Oh, it was good," I'm like, I start to get a little nervous. But for someone's first time I spoke, I could not receive any criticism. I just got up there and I didn't commit a heresy from my first sermon, and so that was good enough for me. This was when I was little, but
Or when someone says to you, and I've said it myself, I've had it said to me, "Oh, that was really good, but you know it could have been better."
But this is a lesson about unjust imprisonment. In 1962, Nelson Mandela was arrested and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for working to overthrow the racist regime of his country, South Africa, the apartheid government. In 1964, justices hand down a life sentence to Nelson Mandela. For 18 years, Mandela was kept in the notorious Robben Island prison. But through all those years, Mandela's voice was not stilled, and international observers continued to monitor his status. He was eventually released in 1990, and in an abrupt turn in 1994, was elected South Africa's first black president. Although imprisoning someone for their political views is wrong, it can sometimes have a reverse effect. And that is even more true today, where Jeremiah was preaching a message that got him in prison. But of course, Jeremiah is someone that we respect today, and his messages still hold true. Zedekiah and the prophet Jeremiah had a complicated relationship. Zedekiah wanted to hear the words of the Lord and trust Jeremiah, but he wasn't willing to do the work to apply the messages from God that he heard. All in all, Jeremiah is seen as a threat to the vested interests of the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, as he opposes their attitudes and practices again and again. It has all led to the point of being cast into a dungeon to die slowly of dehydration and malnutrition, which is the harshest punishment yet. Today we'll see how this late into the monarchy and close to the fall of Judah, that there are competing factions that the king Zedekiah can't really control. Here's a quick timeline of the kingdom of Israel, starting with the United Kingdom. Well, this is specifically the prophets and of Judah, and we are all the way over here where we see the life and times of Jeremiah, right before the conquest of Babylon. Wow, we will start with 38. Can someone raise their hand to read verses 7 through 10? Dorothy, thank you.
Nevertheless, Hear now this word that I speak in your hearing and in the hearing of all the people. The prophets who have been before me and before you of old prophesied against many countries and great kingdoms of war and disaster and pestilence.
That's
Oh, 38, sorry. I think what, I kept thinking, what, that doesn't look like my verse.
At some point, I had put 28 instead of 38. I hope that got fixed, but no shame.
Okay, now, Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs who was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon. When the king was sitting at the gate of Benjamin, Ebed-Melech went out of the king's house and spoke to the king, saying, My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon, and he is likely to die from hunger in the place where he is.
Thank you, Dorothy. So this, oh, is it still going?
For there is no more bread in the city. Then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, saying, Take from here 30 men with you, and lift Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he dies.
Sorry, I got excited. Thank you, Dorothy. But we see the center of the action here. Jeremiah's issue was noticed by an ally. Some translations say he is from Ethiopia. Some say Cush. That's the same place, different times, which is interesting whenever that nation is mentioned in the Bible, because it's kind of at the southern edge of the sphere of influence of the story. And of course, this is someone who has close ties to the king. He can kind of just walk into his room and make a request that's kind of candid. It is a little odd how this works out, and so I'm going to go back to the beginning of the chapter to explain a little more of the context. This starts with verse 1. Verse 2. Basically, a lot of people with weird names. Notice what Jesus was saying. In verse 2, he says, Jeremiah says, This is what the Lord says. Whoever stays in this city will die by the sword, famine, or plague, but whoever goes over to the Babylonians will live. They will escape with their lives, and they will live. This is what the Lord says. The city will certainly be given into the hands of the army of the king of Babylon, who will capture it. Notice this is the same message that we studied a few weeks ago, where he is saying that he will fall, and after he says that, there's a crowd that tries to get him imprisoned for political treason, speaking out against the city, and in the court, he is absolved of his guilt because he was talking about politics, but it was a message from the Lord. But now, in verse 1, it mentions a lot of very powerful and important people who notice what Jeremiah is saying. So and then in verse 4 it says, Then the officials said to the king, This man should be put to death. He is discouraging the soldiers who are left in this city, as well as all the people, by the things he is saying to them. This man is not seeking the good of these people, but their ruin. He is in your hands, King Zedekiah answered. The king can do nothing to oppose you. So they took Jeremiah and put him in the cistern of Malchiah, the king's son, which was in the courtyard of the guard. They lowered Jeremiah by ropes into the cistern. It had no water, only mud. And Jeremiah sunk into the mud. So we see here that Jeremiah is in the same issue where his message is not popular. But this time it is the officials that are conspiring against him. And notice how King Zedekiah says the king can do nothing to oppose you. This is really a conflict between the pro-Egypt and the pro-Babylon factions within the city. And these are all the officials and the nobles. And so it's really nothing that Zedekiah can do to oppose them. At least on the surface, it would have been hard. And it is lucky in this case, if Zedekiah isn't going to stand up for the right thing, that another official, this Ethiopian eunuch, stands up for him in verses 7 through 10.
This is a classic example of what they want from Jeremiah is for his message to be aligned with those deeply in power. rather than preaching what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear. And I like that this Ethiopian reminds me of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch.
It's this story has a lot of cool elements because it's a lesser-known story, but it ties into more well-known stories. For example, the Ethiopian here, which normally I think of Philip and the Ethiopian, but these kinds of stories show how the history between those two peoples go back farther. The history of Ethiopia is really interesting. They had their own version of Christianity and were one of the first Christian kingdoms. So looking for stuff like that is interesting. And also this issue where the king is kind of powerless to undo his decision, but he lets other people kind of undo it. We see this during the captivities. I think it's, during the story of Esther, where the king promises to let the Jews be exterminated, and he can't undo it. So instead, he lets them defend themselves, and so undoes that plot. So there's a lot of court politics here.
Same with Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. When Daniel was, he was told not to pray to his God, and he said no, he would continue to pray. And the edict given by Nebuchadnezzar was, the Babylonian culture is when a king says something, he can't be contradicted and he can't undo it.
So great reason to study these parts of the Bible that are harder to study, but we get to understand a system that is alien to us. But in any case, what do y'all think? When was a time you had to choose the right moment to begin an important conversation? What is similar and what is different about the ways that Esther approaches King Ahasuerus in Esther 5, verses 1 through 8? Can someone raise their hand to read that verse? Yes.
On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw the queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that they may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition?" "It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them, and then I will answer the king's question."
Thank you. So let's answer the second question, and then we'll answer the first. What are the similarities and differences between the story in Esther and the story here in Jeremiah, where the eunuch is approaching the king of Judah?
In one case, they're wanting to protect Jeremiah from death by being in the cistern. And in the other case, Esther is wanting to protect the lives of her nation.
Yes, they are making a direct request to the king. But the point is to save the lives of innocent people.
And there's no waiting until the king extends the scepter. In the Ethiopian's case, he's right there with the king. He is accustomed to being in the king's presence, and he respects the king and still makes this request. And I think the king knows that the Ethiopian servant here will give the king a truthful answer or a truthful request.
Mm-hmm. I think the key difference, yes, is there's a whole lot less of a process in the case of the eunuch and Zedekiah. And I think the difference that highlights, this is something that's agreed in the commentaries, that the way the eunuch acts seems to be that he is very familiar with the king. A similarity is, I think, both the king of Persia and the king of Judah had a high opinion of the person making the request, but Esther was a whole lot less familiar and had less of a history, and so she acted more cautiously.
She dresses in her royal robes to come in that capacity. But she also comes in the capacity of someone who has been told, if for such a time as this, this is your moment.
Mm-hmm.
And in both cases, the kings were given bad advice.
Yes.
And in the case of Esther, Haman had gotten the king to sign a document. When Haman worded it so deceptively, he didn't know what he was signing.
Mm-hmm. It's those are interesting parallels. The story of Esther and also the story of Daniel are a little more known, and both of them involved nobles approaching the king, getting him to agree to something deceptively, and then the king's hands kind of get tied. Of course, here it's not so much of a deceit. In Zedekiah's case, it's just there's so much political force against him that he says, well, I can't do anything. But what does this have to do in our lives of timing of different conversations? I said a few weeks ago when I was talking about the first time Jeremiah gave this speech about the fall of Judah that got him a court case, about how I was advised at the beginning of my ministry career not to bring up politics. And I said, well, if a certain, sometimes we need to talk about politics in order to be honoring to God. But I still agree with that advice that I can't just go willy-nilly and start criticizing political parties, because that's bad timing. People aren't going to listen. They're not going to get the message, because that's how human beings work. And so if I'm going to say anything from here, I'm going to be very careful about how I say it. But if I am in private talking to someone who I have a lot of rapport with, then I can be a little more candid, because there is that trust. And similar here, Esther doesn't know the king of Persia so well, and so she is a lot more careful about what she said, and she kind of delays what she says when she has to make a big request. Whereas the eunuch, who is, I imagine, in the court with the king every day, all day, he can speak more candidly. And there are different fruits that are born by different approaches.
I think entering into an important conversation, like when someone's had, for instance, a near-death experience, and it really makes them sort of a right to talk about God, to talk about having a relationship with God. And so it's always better to listen for that kind of opportunity rather than constantly being up in someone's face, trying to force them into the kingdom.
Yes, I think there is an intimidating factor to the idea of trying to make disciples, of bringing people into the kingdom, because we imagine just throwing the gospel at people. But, I've said when you take the approach of, the gospel is an important part of my life, and so if I'm close with someone, of course, I should be comfortable talking about my life and what matters, and so I'm going to talk about the gospel. Furthermore, listening to other people and where they are, there should be parts in your friendship where you need to ask them about their life and what they're doing. Everyone needs someone who's close enough to ask them what's going on in your life. What are you going to do about it? And the truth is, if you have someone who's outside of the gospel and they're having issues of your life, when you bring up Jesus at that point, if you're listening for the right moment, it's not about you trying to regurgitate the gospel about them. It's you caring about them and caring about their lives and how it turns out. And so in this case, timing is very important. Now, what is an example of a time when you witness a person treated unfairly? And consider David's prayers in Psalms 72, verses 1 through 2 and 12 through 14. Can someone raise a hand to read that verse? Thank you, Donna.
Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son of your righteousness. May he judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice.
Thank you. Can you read 12 through 14 too?
Okay. For he will deliver the needy who cry out, the afflicted who have no one to help. He will take pity on the weak and the needy and save the needy from the death. 14. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight.
Thank you. Now, to be fair, this says, before in verse 11, may all kings bow down to him and all nations serve him. And so 12 through 14 is talking about it's talking about God. However, there was this responsibility of kings to uphold justice and uphold the law of God. And I think we are not the king of Judah, but I think there is a similar charge to help the needy as disciples of Christ. And so, how does Jeremiah 38 illustrate the failure on Zedekiah's part to uphold his responsibility?
I think Zedekiah had put himself in the hands of unwise, evil advisors, and they were controlling the king rather than the king taking his royal duties, rather than instead of letting the advisors run the show, Zedekiah should have been the leader to lead the nation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he was true, wasn't he, Gordon, a political appointee when Nebuchadnezzar came in?
Yeah.
He appointed puppet kings in there. He was a descendant of David, but he is responsible. He should be responsible to God, but he was responsible to the king of Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And his primary mission was no trouble.
No waves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The Old Testament puts a huge emphasis on the people we take advice from. Proverbs, I think it says the same proverb several times about if you want to succeed, you must have a lot of good advisors. And of course, in the line of kings, after the reign of Solomon, Solomon's son, asked his advisors, how should I deal with all this big program of manual labor? One group of advisors says you should reduce it, and the other group of advisors says you should increase it. So he increases it and destroys the kingdom. And I believe that it is the king of the northern kingdom who also is advised to create his own temple and his own Ark of the Covenant and his own God, so that people don't keep going down to the southern kingdom and giving their tithing and donations. And so here as in there, being controlled by your advisors who are not giving you godly advice absolutely destroys peoples and nations. And that is very true today, and it's very interesting today because we have so much advice coming in all the time. When you watch a Disney movie with your kids and grandkids, it is trying to give you advice on how to live your life. And you need to be attentive to where that influence is coming in and whether something is helpful or unhelpful. And then, of course, here, Zedekiah had the responsibility to read the law of the Lord. I'm pretty sure all kings were obligated to write out the law of the Lord themselves so that they knew it. So he knew the right thing to do, and that should have been enough to make him make the right decision, but instead he followed these unjust officials. Now, what is an example of a time when you witness a person being treated unfairly? I think this is the most common today when you have people walk into a group where they do not get all the social rules quite right. They don't understand it. And I see a lot of time that they get bullied and they're not appreciated. And sometimes doing the right thing and kind of alienating yourself is being kind and patient to that person. And I think it's a basic example of when following the law of love, of being patient and kind, is tested in everyday life. Because these are honestly annoying people and maybe not the most mature. But to stand up for people who are being treated unkindly and loving the outcast is part of the call of Christians.
The idea of how the Jews treated the Samaritans, which is really what happened after all of the mess with the northern kingdom, and Samaria is parted and all, and they were considered as lower than dogs. And the idea of Jesus chose on least more than 2 or 3 occasions to use a Samaritan to show the people of God how they should respond to God's mercy and grace.
Yeah, the Samaritans are a very powerful example when Jesus uses them. It's kind of lost today because we know that treating people different from us badly is bad. But to Jesus' audience, he's make a point of the Samaritans. Like I said earlier, the Samaritans were started when the king of the northern kingdom, Israel, didn't want people continuing to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, so he made his own temple. He made his own ark, which were golden calves for the people to worship. And so the Samaritans were Jews that had walked away from the line of David, and they walked away from the religion that they followed. And so in a first century Jew's mind, these were bad guys. But in, sorry, I got distracted by that.
That was security.
Yeah.
Well, in the book of Nehemiah, we have a couple of Samaritans that offered to help.
Yeah.
Sanballat and Tobias, but
Yeah.
Nehemiah sort of rudely dismissed them. So were they bad to start with, or were they bad because of the way they were rebuffed?
Good point.
because they were governors of various areas, and they just offered to help. We don't know what their motives were, but the way they were treated, you could understand how they reacted.
It's, we can see that in our own culture, the idea of the haves and the have-nots. The class system. We don't have a caste system like we do in India, where those of the lower caste, the person next to them who is in the next upper level won't have anything to do with them, but the person above the third person, they won't have anything to do with the last two. We see that in how people are treated, perhaps because of where they came from, their accent, their culture, and when people become citizens of this country, there should be no class discrimination.
Thank you. Because in the mind of first century Jews, these were the bad guys, but so it's very powerful when Jesus uses examples of the Good Samaritans, where the person you would have deemed the least, who would have loved you least, was the one who was the most loving to you. And so you should do the same. And in fact, in the real world, it was the Samaritans who first responded to Jesus as the Messiah, because even if in your worldview this is the person you least trust, they are still made in the image of God, and they still have eternity written in their hearts. And I think that in many cases, being a Christian means you must be kind and generous and loving to people who you have good reason to mistrust and who you think will hurt you. But so don't waste your time saving your love from people who you have an artificial reason to mistrust. Here in Jeremiah, Zedekiah knew that it would be the hard thing to stand up against his officials and stand up for Jeremiah. And Jeremiah ends up being saved by a foreigner and an Ethiopian who he was the one who saw that something wrong was happening. And so he had the courage to stand up to the king and to go and save Jeremiah. How have you been tempted to take credit for an idea that wasn't yours? When have you witnessed this in others? Jesus says the heart is where evil thoughts begin in Matthew 15:19. Why do we do the right thing for the wrong reasons? Because these officials were upset that Jeremiah was doing the wrong thing. He didn't have the people's interest in mind because he was discouraging them. They say, yeah, you should turn back against the holy city and just surrender to these pagans. And so it seemed probably pretty righteous to them to imprison him. Not
There's a saying that goes along with that. First one, take credit for an idea that wasn't yours. They say that success has many fathers, failure is an orphan.
I think it is human nature to try to make yourself look better and to not own up to your mistakes. And if this were a material world, it would make sense. You'd have to watch your own back. But we have a Father who works all things for good, and it's important to do the right thing no matter what, and to take the fall and to spread the credit and to treat people right.
In the age of Chat GPT and all other versions of AI, AI can do so much for human beings, but when it comes to admitting where you got this, when you present yourself as, these are my original thoughts, when in actual fact it was the core of it came from Chat GPT or AI. This is a new thing for so many humans, for many of us, is that how much do we let artificial intelligence affect the way we live and our relationship with God? Is it based on truth, or is it based on some computer-generated help app?
And ChatGPT is really just a way to export, a faster way to export your own opinions to someone else to lean on. When everyone is saying one thing, but you know is wrong, it's hard to say the opposite thing. But people don't grow that way. So instead of relying on the mainstream or computer-generated opinions that people have, look for the truth yourself and speak out that truth. These officials that stood up against Jeremiah were officials who really were called out for relying on earthly means and neglecting the means that God had set in place. Gordon's last lesson was about how Israel had taken a loving for following the patterns of worship, but not the patterns of morality. If someone were to read the law and know it, they would know that there are all these regulations of how to make sacrifices, how to worship, but in between these, there's passages where God is explaining his vision of a righteous and fair and godly nation. If people pursued that directly, then the rituals would come naturally. But if people just tried to do the physical thing and had no heart, well, that's how they got in this situation. And it is hard in real life today to talk about how we are failing and not living up to the full potential God has laid out to us. It's always going to be hard to live up to our potential because God's potential is limitless, isn't it?
Like Jesus asked Peter, Matthew 16, who do men say that the Son of Man is? And he said, oh, some say you're this, some say you're that. And then Jesus said, but I want to hear, who do you say that I am? Mm-hmm. And a lot of times in our conversations, we soft pedal what we don't really agree with in order to have a pleasant conversation rather than an awkward one.
And I've been guilty of that. But it is hard. I mean, we just talked about how sometimes it's important to wait to say things at the right time to the right person. We just don't pander to that to the point where we never speak the truth that people need to hear. And on the flip side, we will always have to hear the truth we don't want to hear. And we don't want to be like these officials who put the blame on the messenger instead of taking it to themselves. That's human nature, taking the credit and abandoning the blame. But we seek to be people of spiritual maturity beyond what most people will act like in the world. Can someone please read verses 11 through 13 to finish this study?
read that.
Thank you, Gordon.
So Ebed-Melech took the men with him and went to the house of the king, to a wardrobe in the storehouse, and took from there old rags and worn out clothes, which he let down to Jeremiah in the cistern by ropes. Then Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian said to Jeremiah, "Put the rags and the clothes between your armpits and the ropes." And Jeremiah did so. And then they drew Jeremiah up with the ropes and lifted him out of the cistern. And Jeremiah remained in the court of the guard.
Thank you, Gordon. So we see that Jeremiah is in the cistern. The cistern has a kind of a bottle teardrop shape, so it would have been impossible to climb out through that little hole. The fact that this cistern in the court of the guard was empty does kind of show how they were in a desperate situation. But Ebed-Melech rescues him, and he shows extreme care in doing so. He doesn't just lower a rope for him to climb out of, but lowers a rope and adds padding to wrap it around so they could gently lift him up, and then they take care of him in that court of the guard to keep him safe. And so we see the rescue of Jeremiah come up from an unexpected place. Sometimes we're in the situation of Jeremiah where we have to say something that's hard to hear and we get punished for it. Sometimes we're in the position of Zedekiah where it's very tempting to just be quiet and let the injustice play out. And sometimes we're in the position of Ebed-Melech where we see that injustice playing out and we must spring to action in order to make things right. After all, we're people who struggle against the powers and authorities of the dark world. We live in an unjust society, and that injustice can be between how friends treat each other, and it can be, societal things. But I hope that we can be people that look for these and look for how God wants the world to work through his design, and be people who spring into action to take care of our brothers and sisters and promote love and justice. Please join me in prayer. Dear God, we thank you for your plan to save humanity and to reconcile them to you, and thank you for all the faithful servants who have lived and died in your service, and thank you for preserving their words and their stories for us to study. Thank you for preserving these hard moments of moral decisions where people either have or don't have the courage to do the right thing. I pray that you open our hearts to be hurt by these injustices and to be humbled knowing that we could have done the same thing. And so I pray that we become people who look to these injustices and look to the way of love that your Son prescribed, and that we can become people of action. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.